follow. This is my email if you want to follow up with any questions. And this art here is kind of cool. It came from an article in The Atlantic that talked, The Atlantic magazine that talked about jumping worms last year, right around this time. It's an American publication, but the cool thing is that the author of the article, without knowing that I had any connections to Montreal or Canada, came up with an artist from Montreal, Miriam Wares, I think is how you pronounce it, to create some art for the article. It's really long, it's really easy to read, and it's a great way to cover earthworms and jumping worms in particular. So I will, maybe I can send that around or something if anyone's interested. All right, so a little bit about myself. I grew up, so here's Ottawa. If you can see this map, I grew up just about an hour and a half northwest of Ottawa in here between Cobden and Pembroke on a farm called Connaught Nursery. If you recognize me, it might be from the Carp Farmers Market. I went there pretty much every Saturday from the age of 12 to 18, and then once in a while after that. And these are my parents here, Grant Dobson, Dorothy Dobson. They are still farming there. They were going to retire this year, but with COVID lockdowns, they figured, yeah, we'll just farm for one more year. But they've got really great info if you're Facebook users at all. So the view from Connaught Pond, that's one that my dad runs, all about different ecological stuff, animals, plants, great pictures and great information. And then their farm page is Connaught Nursery. Both great things to follow on Facebook when the rest of the stuff on Facebook is just scary news and terrible things. So I did my PhD from Cornell, PhD at Cornell, studying the impacts of white-tailed deer and earthworms, European earthworms mainly, on native plant communities. Now I've shifted a little bit. I'm still studying deer, I'm still studying earthworms, and still studying plants, but now I'm still studying forests, but now the forests are urban forests in New York City. The worms are jumping worms, and the deer are still the same deer. All right, so I'm speaking to a horticultural society. You probably all had the same opinion of earthworms that I had for most of my life, which is that they are good, that they're always good, and that they're a sign of good, healthy soil. And often they are, I mean, they are a sign of good, healthy soil, but sometimes that's because the earthworms like the healthy soil, not that the earthworms are creating the healthy soil. Another thing to keep in mind is that we're talking about two different things. So most of what we know about earthworms comes from farms, comes from fields. This is my mom here in their field with these great straight rows and no weeds. That is very impressive. And then this is the forest nearby. So there are two very, very different ecosystems. And so earthworms are going to be playing different roles in each one. So on the left here with the farm, the soil gets plowed regularly. You're planting the plants into, right into the mineral soil, right? And so the soil has been changed. The plants have been bred to grow really, really well in the system. They're fast growing annuals. And if there's any problem with the nutrients in the system, you can add fertilizer, you can add sulfur, you can add lime, whatever you need to do. Forests, on the other hand, they move much, much more slowly when we're talking about nutrient cycling. So the soil mixes really, really slowly. A leaf falls, it stays, the nutrients of that leaf stay in the top of the soil for a really, really long time. And the plants that are growing there, your trilliums, your Solomon seal, and things like that, they're really, really slow growing. And if they don't have quite the nutrients that they need to associate with mycorrhizal fungi or other mutualists to get the nutrients that they need. So two really different systems. Earthworms are great in fields, but can become a problem when they move into forests. So this picture that we have here, this is North America. And in the dark gray here, this is where we have native earthworm communities. So they reach up into parts of New York. This map is a little outdated. There's definitely a few very, very small pockets of native earthworms in Ontario and up in New York and beyond. But if you dig up, if you're looking at earthworms, a native earthworm, you'll find maybe one in 1,000 or 1 in 2,000 or something like that. So for the most part, the forests of northern North America, the forests of Canada, established without earthworms. No earthworms at all. It was the fungi, it was the other creatures in the soil that were mixing the nutrients. And that's been true for about the last 11,000 years. The present day earthworm communities in Ontario are almost entirely not native and are almost entirely of European origin. Oh, and I forgot to mention this line here. Actually, does anyone have a guess what this line is? Audience participation.
Tree line.
Tree line, that's a good guess. But actually, I think tree line is a little bit above, but it's related to tree line. It follows the tree line. Okay, we've got something in the chat. Carolinas, it also follows it's related to that, but what is at the core of the Carolinas and the tree line? And yeah, the last ice age. Oh, look at that, Annise Dobson. I guess that's my parents or my sister. So that is kind of cheating. Oops. Okay. But that's right. So this line here is the last ice age, the extent of the ice sheet that went down, which is really related to where the Carolinas are, where that tree designation is and where tree line is, and how things have recolonized. But the idea is that if there were earthworms up here in Ontario, there may have been, 250,000 years ago, but that they all got pushed down and they were really, really slow to recolonize the forests of Ontario. All right, so, but across the world, this is true in a lot of places. And what we're seeing is that a really, really small proportion of earthworms that are out there are moving across the tropics, across the temperate region, and even the Arctic regions. And so I like to call this, we know that global warming is a problem, but I like to call this global worming, which means that we're getting movement and homogenization of earthworm communities across the world. So there's 3 different things that can happen. It can be displacing native earthworm species. And so that's what you get in some of these pockets in the west of sort of rare prairie earthworm communities. And these really cool Australian earthworms, the giant Gippsland earthworm down here that's longer than your arm. And this royal blue one, I don't remember its name, also from Australia. So displacing native earthworm species in Ontario, it's more likely to be displacing existing invasions and places like Algonquin Park, invading earthworm-free areas. And so the person that kind of kicked off our interest in the West, at least, in earthworms is Darwin. It was his more popular book during his lifetime, his last book that he wrote. It took him a really long time. He did all of these really cool, weird studies, like seeing if earthworms could understand music and different musical notes and all sorts of cool stuff. But he kind of resuscitated the image of earthworms. People thought they were kind of these icky, weird things, but he demonstrated that they're actually moving soil around. And I would like to argue that he painted them in such a good light that it didn't allow that space for the nuance of what an organism is in an ecosystem. They're not just good, they're not just bad. All right, so here's a picture on the left here of what a native natural forest of Ontario would look like. So this is what you'll see if you walk into Algonquin Park. And I do encourage you, if you're ever back there, to walk sort of off the trail a little and feel how spongy the soil is, the top of the soil. And the reason for that is that, as I said, things are moving really slowly. So the leaves fall, they stay in these shallow layers for a long time. They create habitat for all sorts of critters, millipedes and springtails and spiders and things like that. And they retain a really, really diverse understory plant community. And there's these really distinct layers. So it's kind of like an expensive mattress, expensive memory foam. So you've got your pillow top up here, you've got your different layers, they're very stratified. And that's the habitat that things have evolved in. And then when earthworms move into an ecosystem, like what you have in Ottawa and areas like that, you see that it's more, the soil is more like your dorm room single bed that you get that doesn't have those fancy layers. It's just all compact and kind of homogeneous as you go down. And the reason for that is that earthworms are just cycling things really fast. So what makes them great for gardens is what makes them really bad for trilliums. You've probably heard that, like, not to pick a trillium because it could be 20 years old, it could be 70 years old. They grow really, really slowly. And they can't handle this really speedy nutrient turnover that earthworms cause. And so what this can lead to also, when you lose that top layer of duff or organic horizon or spongy leafy matter, then you see a lot of erosion of the soil, drying out, or desiccation of the roots, like you have here in this maple seedling or sapling rather. And the soil loses its ability to buffer against temperature extremes and moisture extremes. So the hots get really hot and the dries get really dry. It can't retain that organic horizon is really, really good at retaining moisture. The other thing that happens here that you can see in this graph, so up here is the top of the soil, and then this is like you're looking in, this is down in the hole of the soil. And so without earthworms, you got all these nutrients up high, and then as you go down, like all of the plants and the plant roots are up here. Whereas with earthworms, this is the dark bars. There's really not much in the way of nutrients at all. They just get leached out of the system and into the waterways. Earthworms are also eating small seedlings, which is kind of cool to see. This is little lettuce leaves that the night crawlers are curling up and pulling down. But they also feed on these fine roots. This is a columbine root here. And I did a study where I scanned the roots of plants growing with earthworms and without in the forest. And there were far, far fewer fine roots, these little red things, when they were growing with earthworms. And there's another cool study where you use isotopic tracers, and you can trace that the carbon that's in the roots goes directly into the earthworms. So they're eating up to about 14% of the fine roots in the forest. The other thing that they do to plants is that they eat a lot of the mutualist fungi, so the fungi that the plants rely on. If any of you have heard of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, it got its name because it really does look like a little tree here. So this, we're looking at a root of a sugar maple, and what arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi does is its hyphae come right into the cells of the plant and form these really, really branched structures. And the fungi give the plant nutrients and water that it can't get itself, and the plant gives the fungi carbon that it generates through photosynthesis. And this mutualism is really, really strong in Ontario forests because things move kind of slow, and earthworms really disrupt this mutualism. And then another mutualism that they disrupt is with seed dispersing ants. So a lot of the things that we love, the trilliums, the Solomon seal, maybe not the Solomon seal, at least the trilliums, ants move those around, move them away from the mother plant so that they get a chance to disperse a little bit. But when the habitat for the ants, that duff layer, is eaten up by the earthworms, then you lose them from the system. All right, but I'm going to talk to you specifically about one kind of earthworm, which is the jumping worm. That's what you came here to hear about, not earthworms in general. They're similar to the European species, but different in a number of ways too. So these are a couple of sort of newish maps that I want to show you, just to give you a sense for how close the jumping worms are to Ontario. So Ontario is not in this map, but it's here above, above New York State. These are the two Great Lakes here. And these are the sightings of jumping worms that we have seen. They are right across the border. Down here at this map, I want you to look at this dark gray through here that goes all the way up to Hudson's Bay. That's where jumping worms could exist given their temperature tolerances. So you could very well have them not just in Ottawa, but up into northern Ontario. They could survive there. The only reason that they're not there is that they haven't gotten there yet. Okay, we're gonna have another audience participation question. My parents are not allowed to answer unless no one else can get it. Why do you think there are no sightings of earthworms? Well, okay, there has been one sighting of earthworms, but let's forget about that. Why are there none in Ontario? Basically none. Any guesses from the
In the north, you mean?
Yeah, or in, oops, just in Ontario in general. It could be here, Ontario, Manitoba.
The permafrost?
The permafrost, so that's a good guess. That's why they're not up here in this light gray. But say here in Ottawa, right here, why are there no jumping worms in Ottawa? They could live there, they can handle the cold, they can handle the moisture and everything like that.
The freezing thawing of winter?
They can handle that too.
Maybe just people don't recognize that they're different from the ordinary worms.
So that is a really, really good guess. And the reason that I think that that's at least partially true is that down here where we've seen this one sighting of jumping worms just happens to be where one of the world experts on earthworms lives. And he's the one that identified it. So I think that that's probably true. Okay, there's some points in the chat. So too cold, we talked about that. Water barrier prevents movements. That's a good guess. And I'm doing a study on that, but it does seem like actually water helps them move, that they can survive perfectly fine in the water and that actually they move downstream really, really well. Okay, but Catherine, you win. They haven't been introduced yet. If you were to look at most invasive species here and they were that widespread in New England, you would be like, oh, they're definitely in Ontario. But the main reason that we don't think that there are really any in Ontario is because there's such strict laws against moving soil from the US into Canada or plant material. And that gives you an idea that they're really unique invasive species, that they really move along with humans, and that if there's things in place to prevent the movement of the things that they hitchhike on, that's really, really effective to prevent their movement. Anyway, a bit about the history of them. So they were in greenhouses and zoos in New York in the 40s, found in New England in the 80s. And now, as you can see, it kind of looks like they're super widespread, but they're actually really patchy and they tend to be very close to landscaped areas at the moment. Presently, the only sighting, and I think that this is still true, is just in 2014 in Windsor, Ontario. All right, so master gardeners and horticultural societies and plant societies in general have been one of the best ways that we've learned about jumping worms. So I'm going to implore all of you to be watchful, especially along waterways. If you're, walking along the Ottawa River or the Rideau Canal or things like that, to be just paying attention to the worms. And they've shown up in the Adirondacks, like really just a stone's throw across the border. So it's time to be vigilant and to look for them. And really the easiest way to tell them apart is their movement. Now this is really slowed down and I apologize for that. It's just imagine this sped up. So the European earthworm here on the right, they move kind of expanding and contracting their body. They obviously don't move quite this slow. And then the jumping worms here, imagine this sped up like 5 times. They move much more like snakes, and that's one of their names, the snake worm. What makes them different from European species is they get to a really, really high density. This bucket is just probably taken from a little, like, less than a meter by meter patch. They reach maturity really quickly. Okay, I'm seeing a couple of things in the chat, so I'm gonna just respond to them really quickly. The scale of these 2 photos is not the same. I've got some side-by-side pictures that are scaled, but the jumping worms and the night crawlers are pretty close to the same size. Jumping worms are a little bit bigger. All right, and then pesticides, one thing that, okay, Joanne, I'm gonna answer your question later in the talk. I'm gonna talk about pesticides later. So another thing about the jumping worms is that they're parthenogenetic, which means that they can just clone themselves. They don't need a mate to reproduce. And so if there's just one, then it can create more and more worms. They're really prolific at reproducing, and they can sometimes have 2 different, even though they're annual species, they can sometimes have 2 broods even in 1 year. So just to differentiate, these are some of the common European species that are widespread in Ottawa, but not necessarily widespread in Ontario. So these are also invasive, but they've been around for longer. And so we've got the night crawler here. That's the classic one, the fishing worm, also called the Canada night crawler, but not from Canada, originally from Hungary. And then the compost worm, the red wrigglers, that have these really distinctive yellow bands that many of you may have. And then the gray worm, which is one that you often see all over the sidewalks in the rain. And there's about 17 species of European earthworms around the Ottawa area, but these are sort of the most common ones. Now, jumping worms, we call this the second wave, the first wave being the European ones that move through. Jumping worms are almost certainly coming to Ontario, given how widespread they are, but hopefully not for a while. They are from East Asia, Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. And there they mostly inhabit ditches. They don't really move into the forests for some reason. So you can put your hypotheses in the chat for why you think, and we don't know the answer, so I won't be able to tell you you're right, but why you think that in their native range, they're just in ditches. They're not in the forests. There's 16 species in North America. A lot of them look really similar. So I'm just going to call them jumping worms for now. And there's 5 species that are invading forests. But I mentioned that horticultural societies and gardening societies are really, really important in having identified these as a problem, as opposed to scientists coming in and telling people it's a problem. And for that reason, there's all sorts of local names for them that different groups came up with. And so it's kind of a jumble. I heard before you were calling them, that was a new name for me, not jumping worms. You had another name for them. Anyway, jumping worms, Jersey wigglers, Alabama jumpers, Georgia jumpers, snake worm, crazy worm, Asian worm, and then the scientific names megaskelecid and pheredamoid that we won't use because they're hard to pronounce. But it's kind of interesting because they invaded all over the United States without people really noticing and deciding on some name for them. So they have a ton of names. And so if you're ever talking to someone that says, I've got snake worms, and you're like, well, we don't have snake worms, we've got crazy worms. We don't have crazy worms, we have jumping worms. They're all the same thing. And the 3 that are sort of coming in from New York State are Amenthis agrestis, up here, Amenthis tokyoensis, and Metaphyre hilgendorfi. But again, they look really similar. And to identify them, you really need to either do genetic barcoding or have really mature specimens that you can identify. So we'll just call them jumping worms. Their introduction to North America, possibly if you've heard of the Cherry Tree Festival in Washington, D.C., they may have come over in the potting soil. They were also featured in Life magazine in 1947 as something that was brought over for the platypuses to eat. And in fact, one of the earliest specimens was taken from very, very close to where this happened. It was kind of cool putting that sleuthing together. And then a little bit closer to Ontario, they were found in Albany in 1948. So it's really amazing that they haven't moved from Albany into Ontario in that time. And so, like I said, I do work in New York City, looking at their parks. And there was a huge inventory of all of the different parks and natural areas with around 1,200 points. And in 2013, 2014, jumping worms were in about 12% of the plots. And in that time, they jumped to 64% of the plots. So they're all over New York City. And in some of the sort of big parks, not Central Park, for some reason, Central Park does not have jumping worms, or doesn't have many. But some of the other really charismatic, beautiful parks went from 5% cover to 100% in 5 years. So once they get in, they move really fast. And there is policy in New York to prevent their spread. So you can't knowingly sell them. The general public gets a warning the first time and then a fine the next time, but a nursery can lose its license if it continues to knowingly sell plants infected with jumping worms. So it is a really big deal for industry. And I'll talk a little bit about the specific impacts of jumping worms. And what they do is they really impact all the way up the food web. So from the plants up to the herbivores, the carnivores, and then the top carnivores too. So the main thing that you will see when jumping worms move in is that the soil looks really different. And usually I give this talk to people in New York or something that have seen what the soil looks like. So I'm gonna have to describe it to you in vivid detail since you've probably not seen it before. So imagine that you are cooking really, really dry ground turkey and there's no oil left on it, but it's that sort of pebbly texture, kind of like here that you can see in my hand. But it's so, you've really, really mixed it really well so that it's really, really easy to separate. And in some places where the jumping worms have moved in, you can just stick your arm in all the way up to your elbow or more. So imagine just elbow deep ground turkey or ground beef. That's kind of what the soil is like. And as you can imagine, huge problems for erosion and huge problems for plants trying to germinate, roots drying out, unstable rooting, even pretty deep rooted plants. You can just grab them by the top and pull them out super easily with absolutely no effort, which makes weeding easier. But it's really, really tough for anything to germinate and for the forest to regrow. And it's pretty distinct. You can see in the forests in New York, an invaded forest might look something like this. And an uninvaded forest has got a lot going on in the understory. I'm going to try not to show too many graphs, but this one I'm super proud of. So I want you to, I wanted to share it with you. So what you're looking at here is from 1,200 plots across New York City. And all of the yellow bands are plots that are invaded with jumping worms, and all of the black ones are no jumping worms, right? And this is just looking at the plant communities within these 1,200 plots in New York City. When you have jumping worms, it's over 50% invasive species, and without jumping worms, it's under 30% or around 30%. Whereas native species, if you don't have jumping worms, it's around 25% cover of native species. But with jumping worms, there's only around 10% of native species. And this these kind of graphs are pretty rare in science, that something is just so distinct. Usually you sort of have to hum and haw and think about it. But here it is very, very clear that when you have jumping worms, you lose native species and benefit invasive species. But not all native species are created equal. And the main native species that can hang on right here in the jumping worm invaded areas are really mainly poison ivy is the big one. So yes, that's a native species, but it's not necessarily the one that you want. But the reason that it grows really, really well is that it has a root that can sort of bob along the surface and then just stick in a little root anywhere that's amenable to it, but it can spread through a really, really big area. Whereas things like Solomon seal and Trillium have really big perennial roots where they store a lot of energy, they're pretty close to the surface, and they just dry out immediately and you lose them with jumping worms. And so one thing that I found in New York City is that like one of the species that I've been following is false Solomon seal, if you know that one. And it can persist with jumping worms and it can persist with deer. But if you have both of those together, the population goes down to 0. So complete local extinction. There were hundreds of plants the first year that I was there before the jumping worms, but when they moved in and with high deer, the population went down to 0. These guys do go dormant, so it's possible they will come back, but I haven't seen any for the last 2 years in the plots with both. If you're a golfer or if you like lawns or have grandchildren that like to play soccer or baseball, it can be really, really destructive, especially in New York City where these parks are usually the only green space that a lot of kids get to access. And you're seeing the lawn just get completely torn up. And it's just sort of a real mess. So just a quick summary of what this does sort of on the ecosystem scale when you get jumping worms moving in. They promote invasive plants at the cost of native plants. And this has impacts on a lot of things, but one is ground nesting birds that really like to nest in native vegetation, but invasive vegetation is not so good, and it's also not so nutritious for them. The jumping worms also, by eating up that organic horizon, the duff layer, they limit the things that live in that, like I mentioned, the millipedes that go on to feed the birds and the salamanders, and then directly negatively affect the salamanders themselves. And then in Pittsburgh, we got sort of a request about this, is they had jumping worm castings, so the poop of the jumping worms were eroding so much that they were clogging up stormwater drains. This is in New York City where stairs and paths were being completely eroded, and this is in Vermont where castings plugged up some drainage in fields. So they cause a real sort of infrastructure mess in addition to the ecological problems. All right, how to identify them. They're, like I mentioned, they're annual species, so you'll only see them usually in about July to September or so. The rest of the time, they hang out in the soil as these little cocoons that look like osmocote, more or less, the slow release fertilizer. So one thing that you can look for is that ground turkey or ground beef soil with jumping worms. If you're trying to, really one of the best ways to decide what kind of worms you have is to get to know your soil. And I know all of you know a little bit about soil. So in the Algonquin Park type areas with no earthworms at all, you're going to get really fluffy soil and these distinct layers that I mentioned. With the European species, this is where you see this sort of really, really mixed up gardeny soil. And then with jumping worms, it's that ground beef soil. You can visually inspect for them in late summer and early fall. I'll get to what you should be looking for. This is another little video of their movement. So this is, again, the European species going along. And then here's another one of the movement. Sorry, there's sound. So that's how they get their jumping name. They were thrashing about there. So the behavior is really, really distinctive, skating along the surface. If you want to collect specimens and they aren't at the surface, you can try mixing up ground mustard with water and that'll bring them to the surface. But that's only if you're going to sort of collect specimens. So I'll just show the video again since it went quickly the first time. So here, look in the blue circle for the jumping worm. You can see how differently it moves along the surface than the European one. Oops. All right. So this one is sort of side by side, much more to scale picture. So the jumping worms and the European or the Canada nightcrawler are more or less the same size. But a key way to tell the difference is the position of the clitellum. And so that's the female reproductive parts here. On the jumping worm, they're very, very close to the head. You see it's in like the first 10% of the body. Whereas in the nightcrawler, it's down here closer to 1/3 of the way through the body. So much closer to the middle in the European species. In the sunlight, the jumping worms just look so metallic. They're quite beautiful. And they look surreal, metallic, purple, pink, blue. Whereas the nightcrawlers have a different distinctive coloring, which is their heads are quite dark. They have these deep vertical burrows, so it's their heads that are exposed to sunlight. So that's the only part that is pigmented, and then their tail usually hangs out in the burrow, so it's quite light. So if you see this difference in color, that's probably a nightcrawler. And if it's all one sort of beautiful metallic sheen, it's probably a jumping worm. Another thing that the European species have is, this one's an easy one to remember since we were talking about eating earthworms, is it has a beaver tail. It has a flattened tail that it uses to push itself along, and that's pretty distinctive here in that picture. Whereas the jumping worm is kind of worm-shaped all the way through. There's some other features about the clitellum in the jumping worm. It kind of goes all the way around and it's smooth and flush against the body. Whereas with the European worm, it's more like a backpack or like a saddle just on the back of the worm. So if you think that you have noted a jumping worm, I encourage you to contact an MNR office or this Ontario earthworm expert that I mentioned, John Reynolds. He's down in Kitchener, but also feel free to contact me if you suspect you've seen a jumping worm. Once they get into Ontario, it's going to be really, really difficult to manage them because not a lot of people have heard of it. Not a lot of people are looking for them. Okay, so we were talking about pesticides and chemicals in earthworms, and maybe that's why they hadn't got to Ontario. So I think that actually the US has got plenty of pesticides too, but golf courses have been trying to manage for earthworms for a really, really long time, way back in the 50s and 60s when you could do things like adding pesticides or metals, mercuric chloride, lead arsenate, sodium cyanide to turf grass to manage for earthworms. And not like that was, you know, it would stop them for about 7 years at a time, but they would still come back. Fortunately, this process was canceled in the 80s. As you could imagine, even if you don't know those particular chemicals, those are not the names of things that you really want ending up in the waterway. There's currently no viable management options for jumping worms, though people are working on some things. One thing that people are working on is biocontrol. So that's like when you introduce either an exotic species or promote a native species that's a predator or a parasite. And you've probably heard maybe some horror stories about cane toads in Australia. and things like that. But actually biocontrol is really, really heavily regulated and has been quite effective in a lot of places. And those horror stories are very few and far between and are mostly in the past. So this current biocontrol program for jumping worms, it's still, 7 to 10 years out. So it takes a really, really long time to go through the checklist of all the things to be sure that it's safe. But one of the problems with this is it's not going to get rid of them entirely. There are plenty of native predators that currently eat jumping worms. So they end up in bird diets, though they're really, really not nutritious to birds, and they're really, really full of toxic metals. So not a good thing for birds to eat, but the birds eat them anyway. And certainly other things eat them too. This is kind of cheating. These are not jumping worms in these animals' mouths, but you get the picture. And they also, like I said, are prolific reproducers and can just clone themselves. So if you miss one, they're just going to keep going and keep reproducing. There's also this second invasive species from New Zealand called the New Zealand flatworm that's really good at hunting jumping worms. And it's, if any of you have ever seen it, it's also called the hammerhead worm. Actually, put in the chat if you have seen it. I would be curious to know if anyone's seen them in the gardens. But they hunt the worms by scent, and then they just sort of glue themselves onto the worm and start just eating the worm through its skin, chemically digesting it just at these points of connection here that you can see. It's really, really horrible. But they seem to be sort of one of the bigger predators of jumping worms. But even that, it's not enough to really stop their population. So some invasive species do really well when they don't have predators, but this doesn't seem to be the reason why these ones are taking off so much. But there's absolutely no reason that you can't collect jumping worms and cook them up. This is a earthworm chocolate lemon tort that was featured in the New York Times a couple of years ago. So I can send out the recipe if anyone is interested. I have not cooked it myself, but I'm sure it's great. All right, so I'm going to implore you, since there's no good management solutions once it gets here, to be really, really vigilant. And I don't want you, I think when we talk about invasive species, we often get very depressed. There's so many things that are hurting the forest. But I don't want you to feel hopeless about jumping worms, because not all invasive species are the same. If we take these 3 different invasive species, the chestnut blight, the emerald ash borer, and jumping worms, they're on a continuum of how important humans are to their transport. So the chestnut blight, once it got here to North America, it was just spread by the wind. So it doesn't need any animal, any plant or anything like that to move it. Once it's here, it just spreads. Even the most remote parts of North America that had chestnuts, they still got chestnut blight. And it happened really, really fast. The emerald ash borer doesn't move on the wind quite as much. And so it was one that sort of moved really, really slowly, sort of. But I think I just heard on the news a couple of weeks ago that the US Department of Agriculture has given up quarantining it, and that they're moving on to other things, that it's spread too much in the United States. But it took several decades to get to that point. So they were able to, people were able to salvage some trees, and they were able to find a few resistant trees that could survive the ash borer. And jumping worms, like we have talked about a couple of times, they don't move very fast on their own. 30 meters a year, almost nothing. It's humans that are moving them. And so if we change some of our behaviors and sort of maintain that good border control, I think that we can really make a big difference. So this is just the map again, showing you where they are and where they are not in Ontario. So how do they spread? It's different regionally and locally, but it seems as though they're spreading through water systems, through creeks and rivers and stuff like that. They can survive just fine underwater. They don't drown. Soil, mulch, and bait are also big ones for moving them. And then locally, sort of within a city, compost and yard waste and tire treads are a big one. And then to a lesser degree, well, I won't say to a lesser degree, also soil, mulch, bait, and even boot treads. And so I'll just put a little plug here again. If you think you see them, here's my email. John Reynolds is the other good one to talk to. And I would say to be especially vigilant along waterways. And a couple of other things that you can do. Don't buy jumping worms as bait. And if you're going to a remote area, maybe don't bring worms at all. A lot of Algonquin Park is earthworm free right now. And the #1 predictor of finding invasive earthworms is it being near a fishing put-in. And you know, fish don't like jumping worms anyway. They don't stay on the hook. They're not good for fishing. Plant bare root where possible. You can rinse them, but bare root is always a good option for not moving pathogens. Don't buy jumping worms for compost. Red wrigglers are much better for your compost, and they're much better for the environment. They tend to stick close to compost piles. So even though they're not native species, they're not nearly as much of a problem as the big night crawlers or the jumping worms. Another just generally good piece of advice for natural areas is not dumping your yard waste into the natural areas. Be careful of where you buy your mulch, topsoil, and compost. A good thing to do is to make sure that it's heat treated. And this is good for making sure there aren't invasive plant seeds and other things in that. If you're gonna buy sort of a commercial version of these in a bag, that's good, but just make sure there aren't holes in the bag that the worms could get back into. But the best option of all is to make your own mulch and compost. So if there's any tree removal going on in the area, there's often a mulching truck that goes alongside. I flagged him down and I said, "Can I have your mulch pile?" And he said, "That's great, because I was going to have to pay to dump it somewhere." And it was just from trees sort of on my block. So it was hyper-local mulch, not just local, hyper-local. Here's another quick close-up of that soil, just so that it's really stuck in your mind and what the jumping worms look like. This is sort of that metallic-y, bluey, purpley sheen that you can see. This is an example of that mustard pour that you can do to collect the specimens and get sort of a quantitative measure if you want to. If you're bringing any sort of logging or big equipment onto your property, not a bad idea to ensure that the gear is clean. If you're driving up from New York City, I'm going to recommend that you get a car wash. There's a lot of invasive species in the United States that are not in Canada. The Chinese lanternfly, is that here yet? Anyway, I might recommend just getting a car wash before you cross the border. There's a lot of things you don't want to bring up. I'm going to do that from now on when I come up. Checking the plants before planting. With jumping worms, it'll look like there's sort of turkey, like I said, the ground turkey sitting right here on the top of the plant, if it were to be infested with jumping worms. And outreach is good. Tell your friends, tell your family, encourage them to be looking out for them. Tell the MNR that it's something to be concerned about. You can do a little experiment if you got grandkids that are stuck at home. Maybe they want to study earthworms and look at their impacts. There's so much that we don't know. And a lot of my ideas for experiments, or how the whole thing works, has come from these sort of mini experiments that gardening groups have done and sort of shared their information. And with that, I will stop talking and I will answer some questions. So if anybody wants to pipe in, they can do that. And if nobody does, then I will start reading the chat box. All right,
Janet, you're on mute.
How long do you think it'll be before they're up here?
I honestly don't know. I'm like pretty shocked that they could have been found in 2014 and then no one has heard of them since. But this is kind of what we saw in the US too, where they were really, really low population for decades. And then in the last 10 years just exploded. And maybe it's just a few wet years in a row, or maybe they get into a certain sort of big retailer or something like that that spreads them everywhere. But I would say that if it's the same as the US, there's, 30 or 40 years of really, really low abundance and then an explosion sometime. But I don't really have an answer to that, how long it'll be. And maybe, like somebody mentioned before, maybe they're already there, just no one is looking for them. But you will, now that you know about them and you know that they're called jumping worms, you'll know it when you see it. They really, really do jump when you touch them.
Oh, they jump when you touch them.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
If we're purchasing potting soil for potting up tomatoes for a plant sale, the commercial ones are all right, like ProMix and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so a
I've
lot.
never seen earthworms in any of the potting soil that I've ever bought from them.
Yeah, ProMix does not seem to get anything in it at all. And I think it might just be because it's so compressed when it's in that box or in its bag.
Buy the big one that is compressed, but the smaller ones are very loose and
Okay. Yeah, I've never seen them. That's not true. I have seen them get into ProMix, but only when it's been left sitting outside for a long time. In New York and places in the United States where they're pretty widespread, it's actually, unfortunately, the sort of community mulch pile that the community garden has that's the biggest spread of them. And and it does happen to be the big box stores that do pretty well because they're just, concrete everywhere and nothing can get into their plants. So in New York State, a big thing is can garden clubs still have garden sales and stuff like that. So I work with a lot of garden clubs on how to sort of run their sales so that they are jumping worm free. But I will say for those of you in Gloucester and Ottawa that since jumping worms haven't been identified in the region yet, you probably don't need to be that careful with those things yet until you've heard that they've shown up in the region. But they're good protocols anyway to make sure you're not bringing in invasive plants or other things like that.
sounds to me like they need somebody, the big somebody needs to do a promotion like they did for the monarch butterfly. They need to do it for earthworms.
Yeah.
About 15 years ago, 10 years ago, the Globe and Mail had a big spread on earthworms. Did you ever see that?
I think I
It
did.
was sort of like a history of the earthworm and how it got here.
Yeah, I think I did. I think I.
It was excellent. Yeah.
Yeah. So I will.
Nothing about jumping ones, but
Right, it wasn't on the radar yet, but yeah, it's definitely true. That's why I'm here. But I have seen this happen time and time again, that it's really, really hard to get people enthusiastic about preventing their spread until they're everywhere. So in New York, when I started working on them, it was kind of already too late for New York. but Maine didn't have them at all. I couldn't get anyone in Maine to listen to. And then now they're all
Sort
over.
of like COVID, right?
Yeah, so it's just, for whatever reason, it's like 5 years behind. But anyway, yeah, we're working on it.
Yeah.
Having the U.S. Canada partners, I think, is the key thing.
Excellent, excellent presentation.
Thank you. I'll maybe I'll just read a couple from the chat, and if I know that I've been talking for a long time, so if anyone has to go, feel free to sort of wander off, and email me again if your question didn't get answered. Okay, so examples of the protocols for planting that we should be following, or a link to where to find them. Actually, I'm just finalizing with my sort of jumping worm group a checklist for gardeners. And so what I'll do is I will send that around after this.
Good.
Okay, what soil types do they prefer? That is a great question. They prefer moist soil and really, really nutrient-rich soil. So that's why they're so destructive in, say, a sugar maple forest. It just has so much calcium and nitrogen and sort of juicy stuff like that. So if you have a lot of leaf litter built up of really nutritious things in damp soil, that's kind of what they prefer. Should we be concerned about other worms? Ooh, that is a great question, and I didn't really get into it in a big way in this. You should, and the reason that we're not is that they're already here, and we think they're everywhere, but they're really not. A lot of the natural areas, sort of in northern Ontario, just don't have earthworms. Places like even AUCL in Chalk River, since there's not a lot of people wandering the grounds there, they don't really have earthworms. And they're really, really destructive for native plants. So you're probably not going to be getting rid of them, but I would certainly encourage you to not be spreading them purposefully, not dumping your compost worms or night crawlers and stuff like that, and to try and keep them from getting into the forest. They're great in the garden, but in the forest is where they're a problem. Okay. Does anyone else have a audio question while I read through these?
This is Joanne.
What?
I asked about here in Eastern Canada, do we have a native worm?
Oh, great question. Yes. So there are a very small number of native worms. There's probably some other native worms that haven't been identified yet in Ontario. But this is kind of like just the last 2 or 3 years have sort of identified them. But how you can tell that it's a native worm, some of them are really, really small, like, you know, no bigger than your pinky finger to your pinky knuckle, right? And they're really, really dark colored. And then another one that's native lives in bogs and is really long and skinny and white. So the native earthworms are very distinct, and you'll be like, is that even an earthworm? But there are a few of them, and that's what makes any management of invasive ones tricky, because probably they're really endangered and really threatened. We just don't know much about them at all. Yeah, it's a great question.
Just a little comment. I have a sister with a horse farm, and when we go fishing, we always take those little red worms in her manure pile. They're the best ones, and the fish love them. The
Yeah.
little red worms.
So I see someone else, Gail, mentioned throwing them in a bucket rather. Okay, so what to do with the worms? So if you're fishing, just make sure that when you're done, you're not dumping them back out. Like good-hearted people, they have the worms, they want to dump them out, but don't dump them into the wild. Throw them in the trash. I know it's sad. So Gail, similar to that, Gail asks, should we be throwing them in a bucket rather than back into the garden? And so I don't think so. They're really, really good for gardens. Remember, they're mixing everything up. They're creating space and air. In the garden, they're good. Just, you can leave them in the garden. Just don't bring them from the garden into the woods. Okay, I think
Have your parents got it on their farm?
they do, yeah.
Really?
Are they still, or not jumping worms, just the European worms,
Just regular ones?
just the regular ones. Mom, are you still here? Or do you have any places that don't? I think because all it was all agricultural land. It's 100 acres, but then it was reforested. So I think a lot of those things that were fields and are now forests still do have the earthworms.
Yeah.
But in the Shaw Woods, which is a place you can go hiking, not far away, like 5 kilometers away, there's no earthworms. So you can see the transition.
You said there's no worms there?
There's no worms there, no. It's never been logged and it's never been farmed. So those are usually the places that don't have anything.
Josie, ask your question, Josie.
Oh, okay. Yes, I wrote there, I had heard about these before, of course, and I thought the identifying feature was a white or light colored band around the middle, and that each end moved sort of on its own. But I guess I was mistaken. I saw a bunch of these in the bottom of my little pond in the spring, and so I disposed of them. I guess I stomped on them or something. But what were they then if they weren't the jumping worms? 'Cause
So
I see you had the band close to the head.
yeah, so the reason I didn't mention the color of the band is that it definitely can be white or like a curly kind of color. It can also be pink. It can also be kind of gray. But what it isn't is this kind of dark brown that the European species have. But definitely the position of it, if it was close to the middle, then you may have had it was still an invasive species, so you don't have to feel bad. But it was probably one of the other European species.
Yeah, it seemed different from the usual ones that I saw, and I immediately panicked when I saw them.
Do you know how it was moving? Was it like snaky, or was it?
Well, they were all in a wriggling bunch all together in a little bit of water at the bottom.
Yeah.
Having sex.
I don't know where they came from. No, oh my gosh, not in my garden. No,
No, but these ones, the jumping worms don't need to. They're just
that's right. Yes.
they just do their own thing. No partner necessary. But so,
Good to know they're not here yet.
but I would say just be. Do you know actually what time of year it was? Just to follow up a little more.
Well, last year, a cold spring, late spring, I don't know.
All right, so if it was spring, probably not jumping worms. In the spring, they're still very small. It's really only in July and August that they get really, really big. But next year, just snag a picture or two and just send me an email, and that would be great.
Should take it.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'll just. My mom says actually most areas in the Shaw Woods do have earthworms, but not all areas. Okay, all right.
Thank you.
So anyone can feel free to chime in while I look through and find some more chat questions. Okay, would Lita clay have an impact on jumping worms? I don't know. Definitely, yeah, we don't know. I do have a study sort of ongoing to look at how different soil textures and different soil plates might affect jumping worms, but it's still sort of a new experiment. So, no answer. Sorry, Marie. Okay, so if we are reforesting an area, should we toss them in a bucket? Unfortunately, okay, so this is a good question. If you're reforesting an area, should you try and get rid of the earthworms? And I think that from talking to people who have tried all sorts of backbreaking labor to get rid of earthworms, it's not worth it. They just dive down, they go deeper, they recolonize. And so I would say focusing your effort on preventing the spread is a much better use of your time. And if you're reforesting with things like pine or oak or beech, then that's going to sort of get rid of the earthworms anyway. They really prefer things like sugar maple forests. How do they create this crumbly texture? That's another good question that I don't totally actually know the answer to, but they, ingest the leaves, and they have a lot of secretions in their gut, and they poop it out the other end. And it seems to be kind of adaptive. It's not an accident that they're making it, because it's really, really a great habitat for them. They can dive down, like they live on the surface, but they need a lot of moisture. So when it dries out, they can dive way down. It's kind of like, it makes it much easier for them to move. So it's terrible for the plants, but it's great for them. So it does seem to be something that they've sort of adapted to do, not by accident. But as far as physiologically, I should probably learn that for next time. But yeah, it's mucus and secretions and stuff sticking together to soil.
When it's very dry, we have a dry spell, and sometimes it's so dry, at least on my property, the ground cracks open. Can they really go, I mean, to me it's, and I'm on Lita clay. I don't have that many earthworms in my property that I've been gardening in it for 40 years on the same plot of land. So I'm just wondering if Lita clay does may have an impact on them.
Well, it does seem like if you've got soil that is cracking, that you're probably going to have, that yours will be not the first place that they're going to invade, that they're going to invade the forests first, because that's where nice, nutritious leaves and stuff like that. But in your case, with that, I've spoken to with a little group of jumping worm researchers all around the world. Everybody says that everybody has only bad things to say about them, except some people in Brazil that have, and I don't think it's Lita clay, it's some other kind of clay that gets really hard and dry and cracked, and that jumping worms invade there, but their populations don't get nearly as high. Like in New York, you might find 100 in a meter square, and they're big. They're the size of they're the width of a pinky finger and the length of your hand. But in Brazil, in these dry, cracked soils, they're actually quite beneficial because they don't get to the really, really high abundances that they get to in forests. So your future of jumping worms might be okay. All right, we've got another question here. If I have a vermicompost bucket, what should I do with the worms once I'm done with them? You can give them to someone else. Or if you can't do that, and the other sort of ethical-ish thing to do is to freeze them and then dispose of them, or put them out in heat so that they die, like in a plastic bag. But just don't release them into the wild. But giving them away is the most ethical solution.